So now I have the shoulder seam sewn and I'm ready to attach the collar, but I wanted to show something to you before I get on with the collar. I think sometimes people have an idea that teachers or designers don't make mistakes, and that is definitely not the case. This was the original collar that I made, and I don't know if you can see this. It turned out fine, with the exception I thought I had lined these up perfectly, and you can see one of the stripes is here and the other fabric stripe is there, and they're not quite perfect. If you kind of roll the collar together, they're off by about 1/8 of an inch, and I knew that would bother me, so I cut out another collar to remake it. But I also decided, since I had to remake this collar, I didn't love having the stripes going at this kind of an angle. So instead, what I did, this is my grain line, and on this collar, of course, it was lined up like this. You can see it going along that stripe. I just drew a different grain line in so that I could align the collar differently, and now the stripes go more at an angle, which I feel like is a little more pleasing to the eye. That's just a little nitpicky thing. It's not a big deal, but if you're working with stripes, those are the kinds of things you have to be aware of. And since stripes are a great little boy fabric, I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. So now I'm going to pin my collar on, and I'm sure you've noticed I don't use lots of pins when I sew, but there are some areas where I'm always going to pin, and you want to match up your center fronts. You want to match up your shoulder seams. And then, as I mentioned early on in one of the earlier videos about collars, your collar has to go to the center back. So I have my center back marked, and that's where it has to stop, because if it doesn't stop there, you are not going to get a collar that meets at the center back, and they need to meet there. So I'll get that pinned on, and I do use a generous amount of pins for this because this is front and center. So if there's a mistake with the collar or something is off with that, that is the first thing that people are going to see. Once the collar is pinned on, what you want to do is notice your fold line mark here for your facing. You want to fold the facing back on that mark and align your cut edges here and pin that in place, and do that on both sides of the top. And then the next thing we're going to do is put the bias band on the shirt, and I don't pin this on. If you like, you can baste your collar on first. If you do that, I would baste it on at about 1/8 of an inch inside, from the edge. I don't do that, but I am going to go ahead, and I don't pin my bias band on, but I typically start the bias band. It has to come in past this edge of the facing. So I typically will go about halfway. So that'll give you a 1/2 an inch from the edge and a 1/2 an inch here. And then I'm just going to stitch this on, and I'll stitch the collar and the bias band on at one time, but you're going to stitch this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and when I get to this other edge, I will stop it halfway, halfway into the facing there. I neglected to mention this, but my bias band is folded in half to make a doubled bias. This is called a French bias, and that is what I'm going to match up all the cut edges as I sew, and I will stitch around the neck edge to attach the collar and the bias band all at one fell swoop. I do use my needle down for this application because that helps when I have to readjust what's ever under the machine foot. Okay, so it is stitched down, and I do a visual check on the upper side and the underside to make sure that there are no puckers anywhere. And if not, then I am going to trim this seam allowance about in half, and then I will understitch. So now I'm ready to understitch, and what you do for understitching is you push the bias and the seam allowance all to the right. You're going to stitch through this doubled bias and through the seam allowance and catch it all at the same time. And you want to get as close as possible to that seam line. So I just carefully do that. And when I do this, I want to make sure that everything's out of the way and off to the left. And again, I use the needle down function because that helps with all this adjusting that you have to do. Okay, so my bias is stitched. Now I will mention, I have seen where people have not done the understitching, but have used a bias band on a Peter Pan collar and then folded it around to the back side so that the bias band shows. That is not the correct way to attach a collar. This bias band should not be showing at all. So the next step is to turn this right side out and push your little point out to get that nice point on the edge of the facing. And the next step is to stitch this bias band down to the front and the back of the shirt. And so that'll be a tiny, probably 1/4 inch seam allowance, because you want to come right along the edge here of the bias band. Move this over here. Okay, let's see if that's better. So when you're stitching this down, you want to make sure that the shirt stays flat against the bed of the machine. The bias has give to it, stretch to it, so it will stretch around, but you want the bias to remain flat, which means your collar is going to be sticking up here kind of funky like, and that's okay. That's the way to get this stitched down correctly. Okay, so here we have it. The little collar is all stitched on. Get rid of my strings here. And you can see it has a nice, just tiny bit of a roll to it. And we are ready to go. Now, you don't have to do the understitching on the bias band, but I feel that it really helps in keeping that all to the inside and just overall gives it a better look. So I have my top almost finished. I wanted to give the collar a press, and I wanted to show you what I use for that. As newer seamstresses, it's difficult to justify the expense of buying new tools if you don't know if they're effective or how to use them. So this is my sewing ham. It's cotton on one side, it's wool on the other side. And then this is my ham holder, which is what I always use when I am going to work on a collar. Let me adjust this camera. Okay. So to use this properly, I lay the collar over the ham because you don't want to flatten out. This collar has a small but nice roll to it, and you don't want to flatten that out, but you do want to have it be pressed. So leaving it on the ham like that, I can hold the steam iron over it and just give it a good steam. So I do that to one side, turn it so that you can see. And then I'll do the other side. And that is how to get a nice press to a collar without ruining the roll that the collar has to it. So if a sewing ham and a ham holder are new to you and you've never used them before, you might want to consider putting them on your wish list. And I'll just leave this little top here until the steam portion of it dries, because I gave it a pretty solid burst of steam and it's a little bit damp. So you just leave it here. Whether you are doing view A, which is a solid piece of fabric for the front of the blouse, or view B, the only difference between view A and view B is view B has the yoke, so but aside from that they are identical. And so whether you're doing view A or view B, the collar treatment is going to be the same. The sample I am working on is view A with the solid front, and I'm doing the one-piece collar. But whether you're doing the one-piece collar or the two-piece collar, you'll treat this exactly the same when you sew it. So I have the collar pinned on, and I've matched the shoulders, the center back, and I've made sure that I stopped the collar front exactly at the front center, because you do want those meeting up at the front center. Then I've taken my bias strip, which is doubled, and I've pressed it in half to create a double bias. And the next step is to sew this bias onto the neckline. And I typically don't pin this because I find it easier to have the collar pinned and the bias not pinned. And you certainly, if you prefer, you can baste this collar on so that you don't have the pins to deal with. I would baste it on at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then go back and you can put your bias neckband on. So we're going to stitch this on. You want to make sure that you have this extended past the front of the top, and we are going to stitch this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the neck. I stitch the neckband on with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I do make sure that I'm using my needle down option as I stitch this, so that when I have to stop and readjust the blouse, everything still stays in place. And I've got the cut edge of the bias matched up with the cut edge of the collar edge. I've completed the stitching, and I'm trimming off just past the edge of the blouse front. The next thing I'm going to do is trim this seam allowance in half, and then I will understitch. And understitching is done when you have the bias, or if you've got a facing on something, the seam allowance as well as the bias band are both towards the right, so that when you're stitching, you're going to stitch right next to this seam line but you're going to go through the bias as well as the trimmed seam allowance. Now that the understitching is complete, the last step is to turn in these little ends and turn the bias band to the inside of the shirt. You don't want the bias band showing like this. That is not a correctly sewn collar. But you want to turn this in and completely put the bias band to the inside. If you feel more comfortable pinning that in place, you can certainly do that. I almost always pin the ends in place, but I don't usually pin the rest of it in place. As you stitch your bias in place, you want to make sure that the body of the shirt is in the shape that it will be in, which means the bias will be stretched slightly to accommodate that curve. Some people do prefer to do this by hand, and that's fine. I find that since all of this stitching is hidden under the collar, except at the very center front, I prefer to do this by machine. So there you go, the collar is completed. And you can see that the only stitching is hardly visible, but it's just this little section on the front. And now when the buttons and buttonholes are completed, this collar will match up in the center front.